Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? Right. I must thank you, sir, General Dava, sir, for giving me this opportunity to interact with such a distinguished audience here. We've had some very stimulating sessions now.
Yes, sir, we need to switch on the mic.
It is on, I think. Can you?
Is it red? Show red. It's a green one.
It's a green one. It's on. Yeah, you hear me? Right. Sir, in the course of next 25 or 30 minutes, I will talk on the lessons from these two wars, which both were distant and unrelated to each other, also as indeed to any role in them by our country, yet affording reflections which could frankly be obvious. But it takes wars like these to reiterate the obvious. For unfortunately, sometimes even the obvious gets buried under the debris of a prevailing and dominant narrative which could sadly lull and distract the national mood and belief into believing simplistic, binary and manufactured thoughts. My distinguished colleague, General Hossain, he sagely covered the war and life in general. Both are becoming increasingly asymmetric, unpredictable, unconventional, and multidimensional beyond all known notions of normalcy. I also take this liberty to rephrase the expression lessons from war to points to ponder over war from the wars, as nothing is definitive, not even how we interpret the so-called lessons. So I would like to put forth 10 points to ponder from these two wars, that is the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Hamas war. Now, first point number one, nature of the war itself, about which much has been covered, and therefore I won't belabor too much on it. The engagement doesn't necessarily entail only the conventional forces, therefore it doesn't entail conventional actions, conventional tactics, or conventional deployment patterns. The nature and composition of the belligerents could be in the form of militias like a Hamas, or entail mercenary groups like the Russian Wagner group, like the sort of hybrid sense that we got and faced in Kargil, with the mix of regulars and irregulars. The rules of engagement in such times can be beyond the UN mandated norms or even the Geneva Conventions. It can, therefore, in my opinion, be described as the rule is that there are no rules, as is currently happening in the Gaza war. The element of surprise and the unknown is but to be expected in such times. So, what is the point to ponder now? Are we geared up to that form of mutative battle in terms of our doctrines, our training, our equipment, our engagement tactics? Are we creating specialist forces for urban warfare, or as seems to be the want in these two battlegrounds? Are we paying adequate resources behind our own existing special forces? And are they getting trained for that sort of hybrid war of the day? Or are we still upskilling the conventional path? We must reimagine the battles of the future and their necessities. Point number two, technology and weaponry is critical, but nothing compensates from sheer boots on ground and basic human intelligence. In the Ukrainian theater, no amount of cutting-edge and fifth generation weaponry and cyber warfare capability ensured a walkover, as initially promised by Putin's short, limited military operation. From the inexperienced Russian soldier to relying on mercenary groups, the war-fighting capability of the Russians was clearly exposed. Secondly, as Israelis realized on the technology front that even their Iron Dome thing was totally breached by the Hamas people. So no defense is unbreakable, and even if you talk of the Houthis that was mentioned earlier, they had done this earlier. They hit the Saudi Arabian oil fields, and despite the American multi-billion Patriot missile systems defending the same, even the Americans with all their technological wherewithal were forced to abandon Afghanistan by a ragtag Taliban militia. So net, the combatant on the ground and behind the machine matters. Motivations matter. Purpose of war matters. This is not to downplay the importance of technology or advanced weaponry, but only to insist on the importance of sheer war-fighting spirit and professional capabilities onto the soldiers. This is simply, ladies and gentlemen, irreplaceable and invaluable. So the point to ponder here is, are we investing in the sort of a warrior who is trained for years, who is blooded in battle, and is a serious professional and life-termer? Or are we toying with the recruitment and training ideas that sound counterintuitively short-term, and the ones which may address other national issues like employment or the rising financial bills? I leave it to your judgment. Point number 3, typically and not always, the diversity of any country is usually on the fringes or extremities of the border areas. And these areas could be populated by the myriad minorities of various denominations as opposed to the majoritarian center, which is typically in the geographical core of the hinterland. Now, these border areas with such minorities can be especially vulnerable of preferring the proverbial other side in a conflict unless they genuinely feel included in the larger identity of the sovereign. Look at Crimea, which went to Russia earlier, and now to the Russian-speaking Ukrainian provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk on these borders. These areas did feel diminished in the Ukrainian narrative for long, and when the Russians attacked, these areas did offer priceless facilitation to the Russians. On the other hand, the point of reaching out to the areas beyond the social usual sound and drama of electoral considerations has to be carefully undertaken. Fourth point, so the point we have to ponder here is, do we have our border areas with various minority denominations? Of the Northeast, you have the ethnic minorities. From Kashmir to Punjab, you have the religious minorities, and you can get a picture. Now, just how included and reassured they feel with the current status of the idea of India or what was there many years back? Have we strengthened the border areas or weakened the turf in any future conflict? The honest answer on that sense of inclusivity or disaffection can perhaps not be given in this room, but left to the person on the street there. Military alliances, somebody just talked about it, blocks, sovereign assignments, sovereign agreements do matter. But always remember that the soldier on the actual war front will invariably be from either of the two warring factions. Ukraine may be an almost NATO or unsigned NATO party and will get arms and ammunition from the West, but the soldier on the front line will be a Ukrainian or a Russian. And likewise, the Organization of Islamic Countries, or the OIC, may be giving many mealy-mouthed statements against Israel, or the Iranians and their affiliates like the Hezbollah or the Houthis may be saber-rattling, but it is the Hamas fighters who are fighting it alone against the Israelis. Next, now the point here is that the traditional alliances we have with Russia, the new strategic alliances with US, or the much bandied Quad, or whatever it is we talk about, but when the summer of 2020 happened, the Indian soldiers fought by themselves. With countries of the magnitude of India and their formidable enemies like China, nobody would be too keen to risk their wherewithal for our problems. We will stand and fight alone, as did the Ukrainians, Israelis, or even the Hamas fighters. Next point, number 5. Talk is always cheap, but in reality, the actual cost of human life, financials, and psychological costs are never cheap ever. War is always unpredictable, and the manufactured specter of quick victory is often a dangerous political mirage. Putin and Netanyahu promised quick military actions, but whether it was the infinitely smaller force of the Ukrainians or the till then presumed half-baked fighters of the Hamas, the cost of war to Israel, if I had to put it in a very crude and perhaps not entirely comparable number of fatalities in that, 1,140 Israelis fatalities during the one single day of Hamas attack, whereas the figure of official Indian fatalities in 1962 was 1,383, almost comparable to the Hamas attack. It was about 3,000 Indian fatalities in 1965 war. So the point is that it was significant loss for Israelis, and the fact that they are believed to have killed close to 25,000 Palestinians is sadly a numb statistics in the event of a war. Putin's Russia is believed to have lost approximately 120,000 troops as per the US, and the count could be higher for the Ukrainians. Matters of war need circumspection and professional deliberations, and not brave political talks. So the point to ponder here is that with such high costs guaranteed in war, sometimes I do get a bit worried when my friends talk of 2 fronts, 3 fronts, or say driving down to Lahore. But do we really imagine the real-time consequences of the loss of lives in such a situation? Do we have the appetite for such losses? You can perhaps get away with such losses in an authoritarian state like Russia, where you are not answerable to people beyond a point, but in a democracy like us, perhaps not. Point number 6. Do the high table of national decision-making have chairs for some sober, professional, empowered, and independent voice of the military? Clearly, there weren't enough chairs on the decision tables of authoritarians like Putin or Netanyahu, for they took decisions fairly unilaterally, primarily owing to their own regime protection instincts. Many senior and apolitical veterans in Israel had been warning Netanyahu persistently of the looming dangers. But of course, no one dared warn Putin in that case. And the blunt, cold, and Malik Shaw-like ability to dissent and disagree with the overambitious political plans can sometimes be useful. Even as an unhinged US president like Donald Trump had the likes of a veteran like James Mattis, who, as probably they say, was the only adult in the room, to disagree with or offer contrarian perspectives to Trump's persistently electoral considerations. It is critical, therefore, that the apolitical military voice remains empowered, unappropriated, and independent. So the point to ponder is, firstly, what is the status of availability of such military chairs or voice on the Indian tables of decision making? Secondly, if they are there, how empowered and independent to disagree and course correct is in our realm? Next, point 7, nuclear deterrence. Now this works, but only to a point. It may have prevented the West from sending troops to Ukraine, but as a nation with a purported 5,889 nuclear warheads for Russia alone and some 90 nuclear warheads for Israel, it counts for nothing in preventing the most bloody and dragging wars that either of the nations have been there in the last 7 to 8 decades. Even other spheres of cyber warfare that were believed to have immensely constructing abilities onto the enemy, well, in this case, let me tell you, it was hoped by the Russians when they mounted concerted cyber attacks on Ukrainian systems, it simply didn't prove as efficacious as originally planned. Now the point to ponder is, certainly you can brace oneself with the new realities of cyber capabilities, drones, nuclear deterrence, etc. But be realistic in their outcomes. Wars go beyond the calculation of nuclear warheads head count and its accompanying suppositions of deterrence. Point number 8. The age-old and unfashionable maxim that there is no substitute to talks has been surrendered these days to have very brave talks, like teaching them a lesson they'll never forget. It is especially true when one tends to marvel and valorize the Israeli ways in handling insurgency as often quoted. But people often forget that for all their supposed skills and preparedness on the same, it is amongst the longest running secessionist movements and failures to contain the same that has worsened from times even till now. It has been on since 1945, and besides the current leadership of Netanyahu, it has seen muscular approaches of the likes of Ariel Sharon, Barak, and Olmert. They were all there, but the fact is the Israeli-Palestinian animosity still persists. So along with the solid military intervention, but some necessary accommodations, Russia, on the other hand, they gave certain privileges and accords, and they were able to contain the Chechen movement to a certain extent by in a more effective and better manner. Now the point to ponder here is, I say this knowing that many people benchmark Israel as the gold standard in containing insurgency. India is perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, the only country that has completely closed many secessionist movements, Punjab and Mizoram, for instance. Again, both entailing minorities, as I just had mentioned earlier. And what had won the day for India? Besides, obviously, the steel of militaristic support and sacrifices, it was the genuine societal outreach and accords, the Punjab Peace Accord and Mizo Peace Accord. So there is really no substitute to talks. I say this because in 1966, I took part in that Mizoram insurgency, and we were facing Lt.Gen, who was the head of the Mizo National Army. And after we came out, the elections were held, and Lt.Gen became the chief minister. So it happened in Punjab. When thing was over, Akalis came to power. So the talks, there is no substitute. You have to, when you resolve an issue like this, you have to come to talks. So now Netanyahu had been recklessly downplaying the Oslo Accord, the two-state solution, and flexing some tough language in order to ingratiate himself in a certain constituency that reveled in such theatrics, which sometimes in India we call it Josh. Similarly, Zelensky had been pushing the envelope on joining the NATO, contrary to, if not a formal agreement, that an understanding nonetheless to not bring NATO to Russia's backyard. So this is not to justify Putin's war in Ukraine, but to suggest that caution before pandering to electoral or passionate cults as possibly partaken by Netanyahu or Putin. So the point to ponder is, we must keep the military out of possible appropriations, calculations, and imaginations in order to have a sense of continuity, apolitical consistency, and long-term strategic culture that is fundamentally beyond tinkering with non-military usage. This sort of distance was maintained, and I repeat, this was maintained by the two very different ideological systems in 1971 and later in Kargil. I hope it continues like that. Again, I leave it to your imagination to see if there is any concern on this kind of a front. Lastly, point number 10. Impact of deliberate diminishment of institutions of checks and balances that can sound early warnings. If complacency, distractions, and active sidetracking of the vital institutions like the judiciary, the muzzling of the press, offered Netanyahu the opportunity to lower the guard, and equally false, we have destroyed the Zionist state rhetoric of the Hamas in the early days of the strike before anyone could drill better sense of sure repercussions and showed that the Palestinians had lost 25,000 lives. An almost similar blinding of reality, suppression of media independence, and for muscularity by the Russian populace. On the hindsight, now they realize the cold advent of a sobering reality for the Russians was awaiting to happen. So the point to ponder is, have we switched on for all our early warning systems, or could we also be lulled into a complacency of own capabilities? Are we encouraging enough our dissenting and contrarian voices that could sometimes be invaluable in pointing out our shortcomings? Or are we a permanent celebration mode of invincibility for all us to ponder? So really, in conclusion, there are no straight answers or silver bullets or lessons, but invaluable perspectives that can cut across the admixture of militaristic, political, geopolitical, economic, or even societal imperatives that we need to continuously conjoin and imagine when crystal gazing the implications for us in any such eventuality. We must simply keep our mind, ears, eyes, and above all opinions open enough to continuously assimilate and ponder. The war, as we all know, be it 1962, be it Kargil, will often come unannounced with unpleasant consequences, and the reality of checks and balances has to be there. Sifting the wheat from the deliberately and purposefully kept chaff of vested interest is always the key. To rephrase the wise words of General Norman, who said, "The more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war." And I would say this in a perfectly parallel mode, and with much gratitude for the likes of Delhi Foreign for Strategic Studies. The more you study and introspect in peace, the less you bleed in war. Thank you very much, sir.